Yeah, thank you for taking the time out of your busy weekend, a holiday weekend. We honor the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda nations, as well as the Métis Nation Region 3, and all peoples who make their home on the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and the elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We make this acknowledgement as an act of gratitude and reconciliation to all whose territory we enjoy and on which we reside. So this series is hosted by Initiatives of Change, IFC. And I'd just like to, for those that don't know anything about IFC, there may be some, I'd just like to give a very brief overview. Initiatives of Change is a worldwide community of people of diverse cultures and backgrounds who are committed to the transformation of society through changes in human motives and behavior, starting with their own. We believe an honest look at one's own motives and behavior is the start of a global change. IFC singles out 4 values as our foundation for self-reflection: honesty, unselfishness, purity, and love. Our grassroots approach encourages local ownership and focuses on accompanying, strengthening, and empowering individuals to be the change they want to see in the world. So now, before we go into Taina and Trent, I just want to mention that if you feel overwhelmed at any point and you would like to talk to anybody, feel free to just send a chat message to the host, and we have a breakout room and somebody ready to go and be with you, just in case. And now, our facilitator is going to be Anne Hartnell. She lives in Vancouver. She's a former staff member and a volunteer with Initiatives of Change, has been for many years in various countries. And Anne recently has graduated with a certificate of life skills counseling and as a life skills coach. She's living in Surrey, BC with her husband, Chris, and is a mother and grandmother. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you. Well, I feel very honored to be being part of this session, And I just want to say, before I introduce Taina and Trent, just to say a little bit about the format. They both will be speaking. I will introduce each one before they speak. And just to and then the questions will be after Trent has finished speaking. And just to reinforce what Mariella mentioned about, if people put their hand up, I can see who's got a hand up and know that they have a question to ask. If you choose not to speak it yourself, please put it in the chat and it will be read out by Case or Joy. So your questions will be able to be put to the Taina or to Trent. So first, I have the honor of doing an introduction to Taina. Elder Taina Poussette Fox worked for a number of years as a certified nursing aide, LPN, in her younger years, and then returned to her home at Stoney Nakoda First Nation in 1967. She has held a variety of positions there, and in 1976 was elected to Band Council, becoming the first woman to have this honor. In 1998, Calgary's YWCA honored Taina with its prestigious Women of Distinction Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2003, she earned her undergraduate degree in Indigenous counseling and has worked at Stoney Education Authority since then. Taina is a residential school survivor and will talk about her personal experience and how the discovery of the unmarked graves at the site of the Kamloops Residential School here in British Columbia affected her as a survivor. So Tina, would you like to share with us what you'd like to say?
There. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Good day, all my relatives. My Nakota name is Ian Shawian, Red Mountain Woman. That name was given to me by a grandmother when I was about 5 years old. The grandmother that raised me and her best friend, Annie Soldier, made a sweat, and they named us. They named my sister, two of my sisters, they gave really nice names, and a cousin, flowery names. And then she said, you are going to be Ian Shawian. Here I was thinking she might call me a Rose or something, but she said Ian Shawian. And, I was very, what's the word? Sassy, I guess. And I said, keep that name yourself. My grandmother tapped me on the knee and she said, be quiet. Anyway, today I am very proud of that name. It's a very powerful name, and it gives me strength to withstand anything that has happened in my life. And in the summer of 1948, my father, Noah Poussette, and my mother, Mary Mark, they received that letter that stated I had to be registered at the residential school in Morley. The residential school was located right where our present high school is, and it was operated by the United Church of Canada. And so my mother comes up, it was more towards the end of September that they decided to take me in. And my mother made me this beautiful little dress, homemade dress. She got me new. We rarely got anything new. She got me new stockings, and she made me that dress and a slip. Everything was homemade. And then she spent a lot of time tanning this deer hide, and she made me these beautiful little moccasins. So she dressed me up, braided my hair, and off we went on a horse-drawn wagon. I was quite excited, actually, because some of my cousins had been in the school for quite a while. And I was excited about going to school. Anyway, we got to the school, and we went up these steps into this parlor, and this big woman greeted my parents. And there's two other little girls with their parents there. I can't remember who the parents were. Anyway, once they registered us, they signed their names and they left. This big woman took us down to the basement. And, my joy of going to school kind of slowly turned to apprehension. So she took us down to this basement, down this hall, and to this place where I guess it was the washroom area with showers. And she said something in English. Of course, we didn't understand. So we're just standing there, wide-eyed, scared. And she said it in a louder voice the second time. We still didn't understand. And then she grabbed us and started to take our clothes off. And by then we were just shaking and tears were falling down our faces because we were scared. She took everything off. She threw them in a corner, all our clothes. And then she doused us with kerosene oil. She doused our hair and our bodies. It stung. And it stung. And then she took us to this shower area. She ran the water. We had never seen showers in our lives because back in those days we didn't have electricity or running water in the houses. My mother washed me and my two younger sisters in big wash tubs once a week. That's how she kept us clean. So we'd never seen a shower before, and she ran it, and I actually thought she was going to drown us. We were screaming and crying, and she was saying something really loud in a mad voice. Of course, we didn't understand a word. And then she used this green soap on us, washed our hair, and then they cut off our hair into a little bowl cut. And the girls and I, we were just shaking and crying. I wanted my mom and dad to come back and get me. And then she gave us these clothes and canvas shoes that we'd never worn before. And she gave it to us, so we assumed we were to put them on, and we did. And we never saw our clothes again. My brand new moccasins, my brand new little dress, my little sweater. And my mother took sick that winter, and she passed away in January 1949. And especially the moccasins, they were the last things she had made for me. And, if they had given those clothes back to us, I probably would still have it, because that was the last thing my mother made for me. And it was a very scary time. But the other girls that had been there, they helped us when we didn't understand. They would kind of whisper in our language, "This is what she's saying." And then we would do what the matron was saying, or the supervisor. My first night at the school was in a dormitory. We had a dormitory for little girls, and a dormitory for the intermediate girls, and a dormitory for the senior girls. Our first night away from home, you could hear, we were crying. You could hear girls crying themselves to sleep. And that was the very first day of school. When my mother passed away in January, late at night, my auntie Cora House came to the dormitory to tell me my mother had gone to heaven. And I screamed, "Who's gonna look after us now?" And I was just crying, and she said, "Shh, be quiet," and she held me. And then the supervisor told her, "It's time to go." So she had to leave, and I had to deal with the death of my mother by myself in my little cot. So there was, you lose your mother and you're left all by yourself. And I was crying. One of my cousins, Evelyn, she came over and she comforted me. And thankfully, they allowed my dad to take me home for the funeral. So I was at the funeral. But in those times, children were not allowed to view bodies or to attend funerals. So we were in the house where my mother's body was for the wake and all, but we were not allowed to see her. That was our custom. The belief was that, a child's spirit is so light that the deceased might take the child's spirit with them. And through all that time, there's a lot of abuses. Teachers, supervisors, they called us stupid little Indians. Oh my God, you're an ugly little Indian. Things like that. We were strapped for whatever we did wrong. And the school, I don't know how many children were in the school. One side was the boys and one side was the girls. And the only time we saw the boys, our brothers in the boys' side, was in class or during dinner time when we were all in the big dining room where we all ate together. And thankfully, our language was not forbidden at that time. And so we could speak our language to each other. I think, which is why our language is one of the strongest languages in Canada. We have about 5,000 people, and there's at least 2,400 fluent speakers, including young people and little kids. And I really thank my ancestors for this. But you spend 11 years of your life, younger life, in that residential school where there's a lot of abuses happening, and you're being made to attend church every Sunday and Bible classes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday or something like that. Eventually, when I was about grade 5, maybe, we were allowed to go home on weekends. Prior to that, we entered the school in September and didn't get home till Christmas. We got a week off at Christmas. And then we did get to go home for Easter, and then at the end of June. And you spend all those years being told you're a dirty little Indian and you're good for nothing. You come out of that school with no self-esteem whatsoever. Always feeling you're not good enough. Always feeling like there's something wrong with you. But in the 90s, our community, our Wesley band had a wellness movement where we took a lot of workshops in inner healing. And I was able to deal with all that anger and resentment, hurt that I had in the group. It was a kind of a group therapy type of workshops that we had. And I was able to not get rid of it, but ease my anger and my hatred. And life became kind of peaceful for me. I was an alcoholic, and for about 10 years, I drank heavily with my husband. And my children took the brunt of it. And I raised my children using corporal punishment, which was all I knew, and which was all my dad knew. But thankfully, my kids have turned out okay now. They've gone through problems, but they're okay now, thank God. And when they found the bodies of those 213 children, bodies of children in Kamloops, I was thinking, I had thought, I'd dealt with all my issues and I was okay, but boy, it really hit me. And as those elders, the surviving elders, were telling their stories on TV, of witnessing children, their friends, relatives being killed. One woman, the priests were sexually abusing them. That happened in our schools too. And then impregnating girls. And then when a baby was born, one woman said she witnessed a nun taking the baby and wrapping it up in a blanket or something, and then throwing it into the furnace, the incinerator. I sat there just crying the whole time as we were listening to those people telling their stories. I really, it just opened wounds for us. My community has not started looking for bodies yet, but there are people older than me. I'm 81. There are people older than me that do remember kids had disappeared, never came home. So when my community starts that search, it will also again reopen wounds. But this is what we need to. We have to live with these memories. You shove them aside and go about your life, but then something happens and you're triggered right away. But thankfully, just like those elders in Cameras were saying, we can't live in hatred. We need to find a way to forgive. Forgive, but never forget. And I have gone through a process of forgiving people that abused me. I was abused physically, mentally, sexually, and spiritually. And forgiving is pretty heavy duty. I didn't go to the people to say, I forgive you, but I forgave them in my heart. And that kind of freed me from the hatred I had in my heart. That is, it's not just my story. This happened to practically every child that was in a residential school. Some schools were worse than others. The abuses were horrendous. And then, of course, child abuses happen too. You do what was done to you to others. So we in our community need to deal with, we have a lot of addictions, family violence, and we use these substances to numb out so that we can live our lives. And so we need a lot of more healing, like we had in the 90s. That really, really helped a lot of people. A lot of people quit using drugs and alcohol after going through all those workshops because they had dealt with the core issue of what they were trying to numb out. So we need similar kinds of workshops in our community so we can heal. And forgiving has freed me, and I have a good life now. I am really thankful to the Creator. I have forgiven my dad. My dad was a very angry, both of my parents were survivors. My dad was an angry man, and when he was mad, he he whipped us with whatever was in hand, ropes, twigs, anything. At times I ended up with welts all over my body. But I never hated my dad for some reason. I feared him, but I never hated. I guess maybe at some level in my little heart, uh, I knew maybe something happened to him that made him angry. So I forgave him. So I tell people I raised my children all wrong because I didn't know anything about our traditional parenting ways. And so I used corporal punishment. I made them stand in the corner. My husband and I, no, I strapped them just like we were strapped in school. But thankfully, they are okay now, and I have a good relationship with my kids.
Tina, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's, yeah, we need to process what you shared. What resilience and courage.
Mm-hmm.
And there will be, I think Trent is next to speak, and I think there will be questions coming in and a chance for you to share more of what you feel you can. And I just thank you very much for what you've shared with us and given us such, deep experiences that we can only try to understand and appreciate your courage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what you've come through and what you've achieved. I think. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
So now I'd like to introduce Trent. Trent Fox grew up at the Stoney Nakoda First Nation and attended school there. In 1996, Trent participated in a training course run by Initiatives of Change, and at that time was made more aware of the colonization process in Indigenous history and Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationships. Later, Trent attended the universities of Calgary and Brandon, earning a degree in Native Studies. He also earned a Master's of Education degree. He was program manager for the Wesley Band for 12 years and now operates the Stoney Nakoda Institute as an independent, nonprofit organization. Trent has produced a children's book and is in the process of creating a Stoney language dictionary. He will speak about generational trauma and how that experience continues to impact Indigenous societies today, as well as his part in developing resources for the Stoney Nakoda language. So Trent.
The photo behind me was taken at the Banff Springs Hotel. It was such a beautiful day, so I decided to take photos, and I use it now as my back screen. Is this, Ina? Thank you, my mother, for sharing your story. So it's this, Ina. Ne, da bon tagi ne. Kaya ni pagawan. Yemin chese. Na, oh yeah, hogam Helen Beaver on tagi natatna. So my title for this presentation is Dagos Kambanande. Supposed to say ne. Or what things are begats. And it translates to every child matters. And I wanted to start by providing an overview of how residential schools began. They began before the Davin Report, but officially began after the Davin Report, which came out in 1879. It was commissioned by then Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald. We always like to say and emphasize A. Just the Davin Report reported that in the United States, education had been used as a vehicle to force assimilation, and that the US had found boarding schools to be quite effective in deconstructing young Indians. I use Indians in quotations because that's not our identity in North America. So residential schools started to open in 1831 with the Mohawk Institute becoming the Mohawk Indian Residential School. They began boarding children at that school in 1831. And so between 1831 and 1876, different schools started being run by various churches. These weren't mandated schools, and then as well, Indigenous leaders saw a need for Western education. So they would send their oldest children quite often to boarding schools to learn the English language so that they can understand and then communicate to their community what the settlers were saying. Then in 1876, the Indian Act was came into effect, and it legislated education for Indigenous children. For Treaty 7, treaty was signed in 1877, and in that treaty, education became a right. So there's two factors there that need to be considered. Indian education was first legislated for some of our, for Indigenous people, then it became a right. And so there's two factors in terms of why we receive education. And as mentioned, the Davin Report, commissioned by Sir John A. Macdonald, came out 1879. In 1883, Macdonald declared that Indian children should be withdrawn from parental influence. And in some report, it states that the desire was to kill the Indian in the child. So 2 years later, the federal government amended the Indian Act to prohibit ceremony. And so our ceremonies across Canada became illegal, but they also went underground, meaning that although they did not practice in front of the Indian agent or school staff, it was practiced in secret. In 1907, a Dr. P. Bryce reported that health conditions at these residential schools are a national crime. And so that was one of the first people to see that things were not so great at these schools. Then in 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, I believe, was acting superintendent of Indian Affairs, he made attendance at residential schools compulsory. At this time, we did not have a school, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But at these schools, as my mom has just mentioned, various abuses took place, cultural and spiritual abuse, as she mentioned, and they were just trying to destroy identity, which for many has worked. In 1958, Indian Affairs Regional Inspectors recommended abolishing these schools. And then 11 years later, the federal government took over the schools from the churches. So they became, some remained residential schools. The last residential school to close was in 1996. That same year, where the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was released. And then, just to make a long story short, about 12 years later, the federal government finally apologized to Indigenous people, and subsequently, various settlements have been reached. When in these settlements, in Native children, the Indigenous children are receiving far less than some boarding school students have received. For example, the boys of St. Vincent. And so when you make contrast what Indigenous people are getting in terms of settlements to what non-Indigenous people have received, it's quite a vast difference. So Morley Indian Residential School, it began as the McDougall Orphanage and Training School in 1883. In 1906, the Methodist Missionary Society came to assist in making these schools a boarding school. So the McDougall Orphanage was actually located just where, between here and Cochrane, on what is now called the Two Rivers Ranch. And then there was, in the Stoney people, a type of rebellion, because once the Methodist missionaries came, Women's Society of Methodist Missionaries, they were trying to deny access to the children. And so the school, parents decided to withdraw their children from the school. And so it closed in 1908, and until 1922, we didn't have a school here, and that was due to the agency and resistance of our ancestors. But in 1922, a temporary day school opened, followed by the Morley Indian Residential School, which opened in 1926, and that's the building there where my mom was a student and victim of residential school processes. That school remained open from 1926 to 1969 as a residential school. It then became a day school and operated as a day school until 1996. So my talk was on historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and I was looking at historical trauma in some articles. And one Evans Campbell describes historical trauma as being an event that is widespread among a specific group of people. It's perpetuated by outgroups purposely with destructive intent, and it generates a high level of collective distress among the affected group. As my mom spoke, we can see that they were subjected to trauma, and but she did mention that her father was would use corporal punishment. What she didn't mention, and I hope she doesn't mind, was that her father was very angry, and so the punishment he dished out was quite severe. And my mother, as being the oldest, took the brunt of that physical violence. And so that historic trauma was very real for my mom. It's also something that's made her very strong and resilient. And so I'll speak about that later. But characteristics of responses to historical trauma, it undermines the well-being of contemporary group members. So for myself, I too went through a period of alcoholism in my youth. I've been, thankfully, my sister stopped drinking about 13 years ago. I stopped drinking in 2017. And for the first time in her life, my mother has sober children. And alcohol, my father was an alcoholic who did have periods of sobriety, but for the better part of their marriage, he was an alcoholic. And so that was something that's been part of my mom's life for a long time. And in her elderhood, I'm thankful to the Creator that we are all sober and trying to lead meaningful lives. Responses to historically traumatic events interact with contemporary stressors. So we're dealing still with racism, efforts to undermine the history, the truth of what happened. So, and then dealing with various addictions as they develop. We are currently experiencing an opioid crisis, which has taken so many lives in the last few years. Prior to that, people were addicted to prescription medications. Prior to that, alcohol. And then, of course, bingo and casinos are adding to this addictions. Risks associated with historically traumatic events can accumulate across generations. And so what we are seeing with this opioid crisis is a lot of children still going through trauma. My mother works at the Nakota Elementary School. She's had to deal with very young children going through various traumas, including the same types of abuses she mentioned. So this historic trauma has transcended generations. So for the intent at residential schools was not to educate, but to destroy Indigenous cultures, This is just my statements. It was a planned effort to eradicate Indigenous knowledge, identity, and self-esteem. People like my mother were not socialized to have a positive self-image. They were not prepared to succeed in life because they were not provided an adequate education. Thankfully for my mother, she was a smart student and was sent to Cochrane High School. And later, and this is always a story, part of her story that I love. As a student at Cochrane High School, she stayed at the residential school and they were bused into school. But one time, while she was back at the school, one of the school matrons, I think was trying to take something from them. You'll have to unmute too. Anyway.
A radio record player.
Okay, yeah. So that matron was trying to take a radio record player from them. And I think she resisted. The matron then I think grabbed her by the hair, and by now she was a teenager, and she fought back. She slapped the school matron, and that resulted in her expulsion from school. But there's always good people in life, and there was one teacher, was it Mr. Thiessen, that she that went to her parents and told her that she was too smart to not finish school. And so he set her up at the Calgary School for Nursing Aides, and she attended that school, becoming the first Stony woman to leave high school and pursue post-secondary education. She worked as a CNA, what is now called an LPN, for about 7 years before returning to Morley. During this time, racism was the accepted norm. A racist nurse almost ruined my mother's training as a CNA. But once again, there's always good people. This nurse was a nurse in charge or charge nurse. And she, one of her subordinates told the Calgary School of Nursing what had happened and that my mother was in fact a very good nurse with great potential. And so the school decided to disregard that nurse in charge's report. And she went on to finish the training and work as a CNA. My mom tells me that after beginning a healing process, she used to only remember the trauma that was inflicted upon her by her father, but now she remembers her father sitting amidst a sea of white faces. As he works outside, he's very dark, but his dark face in a sea of white faces, but he was the proudest. He was beaming, and when she left the reserve, he would often write to her telling her to come home. So she remembers now the love he did have for her. I think that was something she blocked out for a long time. Now, we need to start talking about the truth, about the history of in Canada, about Indigenous history in Canada. It is not taught to students in Canadian schools. And so students are not educated or socialized to understand historical trauma, much less Indigenous issues today. Truth needs to be in the K-12 curriculum. Most Canadians know very little about Indigenous history and its impact on Indigenous people today. When I was taking my master's program in education, I was sitting with a cohort of 22 teachers from Calgary Board of Education. There was 3 of us who were Indigenous. And I posed a question: what area First Nations exist around Calgary in the Treaty 7 region? And only 1 student out of the 19 non-Indigenous students said Sutina. And that was only because the Ring Road has long been a controversy in Calgary. And so they knew nothing about the Mitsitapi, the Blackfoot. They knew nothing about the Sutina. They knew nothing about the Efta, the Stony. And still today, they don't know that half of our community in Morley are Nehiyaw. They are Cree. My mother's grandmother, Jenny Cecil, who raised her after the death of her mom, my grandmother, was full Cree. So there's a lot of Cree lineage in our community, and people don't know that. But there's a lot of truth that needs to be told still in order for Canadians to start understanding Indigenous issues. Now, in terms of reconciliation, I pose a question: how can we have reconciliation when students are not taught the truth? I learned about the treaties in school, but I never really learned about what happened in residential schools. That's something not taught. And I believe that reconciliation will take time because it has to start within Indigenous communities, families, clans, and nations. When I say families, as my mom said, she used corporal punishment when we were children. Prior to her healing experience, she was a very angry person. But in my lifetime, she's been a sober parent. And so I think my 2 older sisters who passed away, my 2 older siblings, Moses and Kim Fox, who have both passed away, bore the brunt of her anger. My sister Nisha and I, who are still living, we saw a sober parent in our mother, and we are grateful for that. I think because of that, a lot of our friends used to stay with us almost all summer, as my mom was telling me. Excuse me. And then within clans, there's a lot of our clans are not united in our community. For example, politics has divided so many of our clans. My mom's clan, the Pusat clan, very much united. With in our last election, 3 members of that clan ran for chief And so there's divisions, three ways within our clan. So reconciliation must start in our own communities. In Morley, we have the Berspa, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations, what are now called the Berspa, Wesley, Chiniki. And there's constant political battles between the three. So when we talk about reconciliation with non-Indigenous society, we're taking a giant leap forward. We need, this process needs to start here in our communities first. As children of residential school survivors, I believe we also need to look beyond and see our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents as children facing various abuses. My mom did not share in her story how about her first visit to a dentist. Her tooth, and some of her teeth were extracted without the benefit of anesthesia. And that traumatized her even further. She said she was crying, but she was slapped by the dentist, and so I had to stay quiet with tears running down her sides. And I look at that little child, that little girl, and I consider what she must have felt like at that time, what she must have felt like to lose her mother and have no one to support her at the school. So we need to look at our parents as victims of residential school. There's a situation developing in which as younger people start reclaiming their Indigenous identities, that they are referring to residential school survivors as not being true elders because of Christian influence. And that's a bunch of BS. My mother is an esteemed elder in our community. And so too are many in our community. The fact that they were victims of residential school does not take away from the knowledge that they have acquired over their lifetimes. My mother still takes us to her ancestral berry picking patches, their hunting grounds in the Wipers Valley. She's practiced, she's been a sun dancer. She's danced at sun dances, has been a head sun dancer. She smudges on a daily basis. She has never lost her connection with our culture. And so that's probably true for many of our elders, but fundamentalism can be part of the process here. And so blaming, I think perhaps in stating that they're not true elders, is quite divisive and further victimizes them in their elderhood. Then as survivors, parents also need to take responsibility and apologize when it's necessary. As stated, it begins at home. Reconciliation begins at home. Canadians need to consider how that would affect their children and be open to learning about the Indigenous worldview. What I mean by that is, think of your own children going through their first day of school, like my mom did, experiencing the abuses that they were subjected to, having their teeth extracted without the benefit of anesthesia, and being socialized to be ashamed of who they were as Indigenous people. So in or whatever culture that you come from, and try and see how that would affect your children, and how it would affect their children. We need to look within as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people and learn about Indigenous residential schools, historical trauma, and as I mentioned, if we're not telling the truth, we can't have reconciliation. So there's different resources you can look into, including yesterday, as I was preparing this, I went through the Indigenous Services Canada website, which provides a lot of information, the Canadian Encyclopedia website, YouTube videos. There are so many now about Indigenous people telling their stories. So perhaps look up a video that's from your area and learn about what that experience is. Scholarly articles. Also connecting with Indigenous organizations and communities and with residential school survivors. And of course, grandfather Google. We like to joke about Google being the one who holds knowledge, wasnogia, and some of our youth are starting to call it grandfather Google. Anyway, so those are some resources that you can be looking into as people interested in learning about the residential school experience and historical trauma.
Trent, you really, sorry, you've given us an amazing amount of background and things to reflect on, and also your journey through all this too. And what I'm hearing from what you've experienced and worked through for yourself, you're passing on to the next generation. You're using what you've experienced, what I understand, to educate and connect and give a different kind of future for the next generation. And I honored that. And I think both you and Tyner have given us a huge amount to process and to think. But I think there may be some questions from people.
If I can finish my last slide there, please.
Yes, sorry, okay.
Yeah, I'll just take one, like 30 seconds. I can't see it now.
Yeah.
So I was just gonna thank you for taking time to listen to my mother's story, my perspective. This is our experience, our truth, and that there's many who have not survived. In 2021 at Kamloops, BC,
yeah,
unmarked graves were found, and this woke a nation, as one person on Facebook wrote. In their final sleep, they woke a nation. Ishnis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ishnis.
So yes.
I think what I picked up, there's many things, but I'm thinking of what Tyner was talking about, the healing, and there's still a process that still needs to keep going on. And Trent, you raised a very important question when you talked about education. And I know you were talking about schools on maybe reserves, but I think also I was thrilled to a certain level to hear that my granddaughter, who's 12, is learning more and more about the First Nation where her school is, and elders come in to speak. And I think that's just the beginning. There's so much more we need to keep keep teaching and keep learning. And your sharing today has been part of that journey for those of us who are not Aboriginal, but part of the journey and all the hurts that have been inflicted. I'm trying to see at the top. I'm not very good on technology, so I don't see a hand raised. But
option. So if you have a question, please do that. And I believe we have one.
okay, I see. First one in my list is Elizabeth. Slanke, would you like to give your question and say who it's to, Elizabeth?
Yeah, the question, first of all, thank you so much for all your sharing. It's huge. And I have 3 tiny questions. You can reply with a yes or no. First, at school, residential school, did you learn anything useful other than English?
Did I learn anything useful? Well, domestic skills. I guess how to I can't even think of anything really.
Thank you, Tina. Second question. No, actually, that would be to Trent. I heard bingo being mentioned as part of addiction. Till now, in the last 12 years that I've been in Canada, I've heard that bingo is part of native culture. So what is it, culture or addiction?
So I've never heard bingo to be part of our culture.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Sure, no.
Okay.
But gambling has been part of our culture through hand games. And so hand game tournaments still happen. And those are, at those events, they're betting against each other. So gambling has been part of our culture in the past. And I think bingo and casinos kind of replaced some of that gambling aspect, but no, we did not have bingo as part of our culture, although a lot of our people really took to it in the 80s, 90s. Thank you.
We had other games like those, we made these little things with the bones of deer, and we tried to hook them onto this needle, and people would have, they would offer certain things to be won. So I guess that was a kind of a, that's our casino back then.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, sorry, I have one last question, very short.
It
Is
has to
Sundance...
be short because we've got
Yeah.
a long list of people waiting to ask
okay,
questions.
forget it.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, then thank you. Mangalam, I think you're next. Would you
Yes,
like to?
yes. This is not a question, but I just want a comment. Tina, you are honest. I mean, real in the real mean. You had an honest conversation, and something that struck me. I did the forgiveness as a study, as a thesis, but I was wanting to see what people have said that they have forgiven. I have heard, but I have never witnessed something that you said, and I wanted to read you a little. Forgiveness is neither a common routine gesture nor an everyday habit. Rather, it is a hidden original flower that blooms anew each time from the soil of pain and self-control. You have proved to me today, Tina, that you have done this, and I feel so elevated, by witnessing you and your son, Trent. You breathe this peace, something that first time I have witnessed. And Trent, for you, you have in your questions, in your talking, you never said we should and we must. And you are always using the word, we need to do this, we need to. That's another non-violent word. I mean, you, both of you had edified me, and really I am happy and thankful to both of you. And I thank also Joyce for inviting both of you for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Magdalene. The next one I see is David Forbes. David, could you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Thank you. Hello, Tina and Trent. I haven't seen you for a long time.
Hi.
And Joy. So I just wanted to let you know that I had a kind of a different education experience learning about the peoples of Canada that I didn't know anything about. And it's because of some of Tina's family who helped me in that journey. Because when I grew up in Vancouver Island, I didn't get any history about the Native people of that part, or the stories that I heard about the peoples across Canada had nothing to do really with the people. And so when I started to learn a little bit about the Stonies, the Nakota people, my eyes started to open. And because of that, as you're probably aware, I went to Ottawa, and boy, I thought I knew something when I went out there. But colonization, I had to really struggle. And I think that is something that people need to understand about the colonization. It's not going to be an easy thing, and just attending a couple of Native events is not going to be the answer, but it's a start. You know, hopefully people's eyes will start to open. I'm grateful that you're doing something like this, and lots of people need to do presentations and involvement like this. I'm also grateful for Initiatives of Change, because through that organization, when I was in Ottawa for 2 years, I met some wonderful people who have similar goals, and I'm sure want to understand more about what happened. It's an amazing thing that we can do this today with the technology. And so thank you for letting me be part of this, and just spending a little time with you today. And hopefully maybe I'll get up to see Kenny soon, and at least go for lunch or supper somewhere, you know. And it, like Tina Cora was, you know, she didn't talk much, but Cora was special to me because she included me with the family. And that's how I started to learn a little bit more about the Stoney people. And I'm grateful for that. So, and Tina, I worked with you for a little bit on the council, and that was quite an interesting experience to work with Chief and Council.
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you.
Thank you. Freddie, Freddie Bodmer, I think you wanted to ask a question. If you could unmute.
Yes, I have. Thank you very much. Tina and Trent, thank you very, very much. You know, in Ko, Rajmohan Gandhi, one of the grandsons of Mahatma Gandhi, introduced one of your chiefs, and he said, of course, I am a phony Indian and you are a stony Indian. What he wanted to say was that Columbus discovered someone who was already a long time there. But what I'm interested is what you talk about is so badly needed in the whole world. Don't limit it to your region. I've spent the last 15 years in India, and there is a colossal threat coming in India on a homicide, genocide thing. And if you can use this and share it all over the world, And I like to be part of that. And I wish I only have a morally written address, but Trent and Tina, could I have your email address so I could correspond with you? Because I think I'd like to reconnect with you, but also across the world, especially at the moment to India. So I don't know how we could do that. I don't know whether you can blend it in somewhere or show.
If
But-
Tina can, will allow it, I can send it to you, Freddie.
Please. I would be
Yes.
very, very grateful.
Yeah.
Because this is it, what we need very badly. And you know, we're 200 kilometers away from Switzerland. Is a war raging between the Ukraine and Russia.
Mhm.
There's a lot of violence coming up. And I think, you know, your things at the moment, they go far wider and deeper than you think. So please, we need your help.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just want to add on my Aunt Marianne that she was married to a very violent man and suffered a lot of abuse after residential schools. And like many of our parents, she was also an alcoholic. But after the Healing Foundation provided funds and she attended healing workshops, my aunt just stopped drinking and she lived the rest of her life as a sober pillar in her family. And so we're always grateful for that. But sadly, she passed away about eight years ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much. And I'm sure there's many more questions that people have in their hearts that will process that they'll be wanting to ask at some point. But at this point, I'm going to invite Case Lakwahala, one of the IFC Board of Directors, to just say a few words.
Hello, everybody. This is Case. And thank you for whoever shared that quote earlier from Raj Mohan Gandhi. I am from India. I moved to Canada about 2 years ago. So I feel I feel parallels between a lot of what you have shared and what I or my ancestors have experienced in their past in India. With that note, on behalf of the Board of Initiatives of Change Canada, I'd like to thank Elder Tina and Trent for your inspiring and moving sharing and for sharing your experiences with the residential schools and multi-generational trauma and racism. It has been a valuable learning, just being part of this session and attending it, and understanding a little more on the truth and history of Indigenous peoples and how it affected the formation of identities, and how can we as Canadians reflect on this and help start these conversations within our community and within our future generations to be sensitive enough and have the awareness for change and reconciliation for our future generation. IFC is glad to offer these fora towards the road of understanding, healing, and reconciliation. For these circles of Indigenous worldviews to continue, and on this note, I'd also like to thank the team that has taken this amazing effort to bring this platform for everybody here. We need your help, as and when you can give. You can. I think Mariella will share the link for the Canada Helps in the chat. If any of you would like to give, please give towards it. You can also find the link and you can find more information about initiatives of change on our website. It's www.ca.ifc.org. On this final note, I sort of reflected, or one thing that struck me that Trent had mentioned is, if we are not telling the truth, we cannot get to reconciliation. And that sort of thought struck me, and I'll leave that with you all. on that thought today. Thank you so much.